Hey everyone, this is Identi3, a podcast all about Web3 and digital identity. My name is Nick, I'm the CEO of Doc, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Kim Hamilton Duffy. Welcome to Identi3, Kim.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, our pleasure, and the vast majority of people in the what we call self-sovereign identity or the decentralized identity ecosystem will be very familiar. You've had a lot of influence on the technology and in the sector, and you certainly, it seems like you've been working in the space for almost as long as it's existed. But for those who are listening who are not quite familiar, just a couple of quick highlights just to kind of by way of introduction, and we'll maybe get into more of this as we go through. But you're currently the Director of Identity and Standards at the Centre Consortium. You've been there for 2 years. And also you're in the World Economic Forum for Digital Identity on the Technical Working Group. You're the chair of that group, and you've been working in that role since, I think, the start of this year. So it's a really interesting position that you're sitting in.
Yes, thank you. It's I am enjoying getting a view, with Centre and our approach to decentralized identity. It's a very, sort of practical use case focus, but then the World Economic Forum, it's an opportunity to think about and work on these longer lead problems as well.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And so as I mentioned, you're the Director of Identity and Standards at Centre. Can you tell me and also the kind of listeners what Centre is?
Yeah, Centre is a member-based consortium. It was founded by Circle and Coinbase to provide shared governance for USDC, which is the US dollar-backed stablecoin. So that's a stablecoin issued by Circle. So Centre was founded to provide the sort of open source, open governance standards around it.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part is obviously the kind of stablecoin is interesting in itself, but that it feels like that would open up a can of worms if we dug too much into that. And I think maybe more relevant for the podcast is probably getting into another of the main projects, which is Verite, which is another super interesting and a high level project that the Centre are working on. Can you please let us know what Verite is and what it does?
Yeah, Verite is interesting. It's Centre's second major standard that we push forth. So Verite is a set of open source protocols enabling secure, portable, and privacy-preserving approach to digital identity. It's built on existing decentralized identity standards, which means we're not introducing yet another decentralized identity standard. Rather, we think of it as an open source toolkit that provides recipes and patterns that are focused on financial use cases. For example, know your customer, KYC, KYB, or know your business partner. And just lastly, in case people aren't familiar with decentralized identity, or another synonym for it is self-sovereign identity, it's a set of standards, technology, and principles that enable individuals to manage their identity data. And we'll be getting into a lot more detail as the podcast unfolds, but you can think about the standards as allowing you to express a wide range of identity claims. So government identity docs, such as driver's license, proof of skills, education, employment. And then in the case of Verite, we're focused on ones like my credit score is this, I've passed through the KYC checks of an institution, things like that.
Oh, very interesting. And I think that and even if we turn this into an individual context, because I think some of the people that listen to Identi3 are, garden variety internet users, Kim. And so I think what you explained there was maybe a more technical use case as well. But for those at home that are maybe not as clued up on the technicalities of SSI, why should an individual online care about decentralized identity? What does it get them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll try to tease that apart a bit. So decentralized identity in the context of finance, it can help with it can help with both decentralized and traditional finance. So traditional finance, regulations require financial organizations to collect and share your data when you transact. And that's a variety of things, anti-money laundering, fraud prevention, things like that, ensuring that you're not funding some illicit activity. So that's the case already with traditional finance. And right now, we in most of the world rely on what I'll refer to as paper ID. We don't have a coherent solution to digital ID. We have at best pseudo-digital ID, which might be take a scan of your driver's license, upload it. So lack of a cohesive digital ID solution means that when you onboard to a new financial institution or transact, you're onboarding and re-onboarding. So you're sharing those same original identity documents again, taking selfies to prove that you're a live person. And all of this leads to over-collection. And so this proliferation of sensitive identity data has resulted in fraud, identity theft. And so in traditional finance, the way we talk about, sort of digital ID, and then with decentralized ID enhancements, that it reduces friction in onboarding, but then also improves privacy. In DeFi and crypto, it's a slightly different story. So, people may be confused about why we're talking about identity in the context of DeFi. So, originally with Bitcoin transactions, one of the benefits is that they're pseudonymous. It's associated with an address, not a known person, even though you can sort of reconstruct the graph of transactions. But for a variety of reasons, as the DeFi, decentralized finance ecosystem progressed, there is increased interest in the use of identity. So, for example, even if in the current state, we're increasingly changing, where DeFi transactions aren't regulated, DeFi pools would want to attract institutional development and institutional investment. So, for example, a lending pool might want to prove that they are keeping out OFAC sanctioned participants or any other types of participants linked to illicit activities. So, or they might want to restrict to residents of certain locales just to comply with different regulations. So when we started Verity, we saw beginning attempts to apply traditional identity solutions to DeFi, but the proposed solutions had shortcomings. So those might be they're closed networks, or you're locked in, so you have to buy into a certain brand of DeFi identity and you can't participate openly elsewhere. And basically a lot of the solutions weren't solving the problem of oversharing or overproliferation of data. And so when you combine sort of this collection of identity data with open, transparent transactions such as a blockchain provides, you get a real disaster waiting to happen, with people being able to learn everything about you. So that's where decentralized identity, decentralized identity is it's a type of digital identity that's designed to put individuals in control of their data, and it's designed to minimize the potential for lock-in, increase privacy guarantees, reduce the risk that people can correlate a whole bunch of information about you that you don't want to share. Now, this isn't to say that it is intended to run afoul of regulations. That's one of the key things about Verity. We designed it in step with kind of the regulatory requirements. So just to summarize, the benefits of decentralized identity in this case: giving individuals control over your data, so that could reduce friction in onboarding across new solutions, and enhance the effectiveness for institutions as well.
And I guess it's difficult when we've been talking to maybe platforms running, or kind of organizations or DAOs in many cases running DeFi platforms. I think there's more acceptance now of the fact that regulation is coming, and they'll need to try and find a way of ensuring that they're compliant. Like we found that, I don't know if you've found this on your travels as well, Kim, but certainly a couple of years ago, it was a kind of ostrich syndrome where it was kind of put your head in the sand and, we're DeFi, they'll never get us. But of course, regulation always finds a way, as we've found out from the crypto industry. So I don't know if that's an experience that you've found as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been really interesting to see. In fact, early when we were designing Verity, we had the opportunity to talk to people who were a combination former regulators, people who were involved in FinCEN. And what was really interesting was that everyone is very aware of the problems with traditional ID. And it seemed to be a really good time to rethink the way we deal with identity data. And so I think there was a convergence of a lot of interesting developments, including the mobile driver's license effort, which ended up being designed with many of the principles of decentralized identity, such as reducing the what we call phone home to the issuer. So that's a sort of thing like, say you get an identity. Right now I have my driver's license, and say I use it to prove I'm of age, or I get pulled over, something like that. So a risk with digital driver's license or any digital document is, say, every time you use it, if it ends up making a phone home or calling back to the issuer, then the issuer or whoever, I use driver's license in that case, could be anyone. The risk is that some entity can learn a whole lot about your behavior. And we know from the existence of data brokers and stuff that these are treasure troves, very valuable. And so these are the kinds of risks that regulators are aware of. And they were eager as well to design a more or be open to more holistic solutions in which people are more in control of their data.
Yeah. And it's important as well, like the phone home way that I've often heard it phrased. It's a nice way to think about it. One of obviously the core tenets of SSI is to have the separate notion of the issuer, the holder, the verifier, and never the twain should meet. So I think that's really an important aspect. And I think if regulators weren't there keeping an eye, we would get back what we already have, these systems where it is possible to track to a large extent what's happening, what people's movements are, and yet be ashamed to replace all of that with the same again. So it's good that we're going to, it feels like we're going in the right direction at least. On Verity's website, there's a list of like several opportunities for this technology. Which one excites you the most, Kim?
Yeah, the most interesting is also the most challenging, and it's not easy. It's not overnight, but that's the ability to enable finance to become more globally inclusive. And so I want to kind of tease that apart because it is sort of a glib statement that people say. So, starting again from a reference of paper identity and moving to digital identity. So paper ID in financial transactions, slow and efficient, leads to fraud. So digital identity, not even talking about decentralized identity, it's introduced as the ability to improve on the slowness and inefficiency, but so while it can reduce some forms of fraud, it can introduce others. Now, those can be mitigated, for example, through FIDO2 standards, but the additional risks and harms that are brought in include ones that we've talked about, so potential lock-in, ability to track or surveil your online activities, but these are the parts where I think they're not immediately obvious to people. So a big risk with potential digital identity solutions is discrimination and exclusion. So if, say, benefits are dependent on you having a digital ID, but you have a hard time accessing that digital ID. So what's an example of that? Suppose if only Google and Apple had a monopoly, or suppose just Apple had a monopoly on giving you access to your mobile driver's license. That's a high barrier to entry. So, people on this call or listening to this podcast may not think it a problem to own an Apple iPhone, but, suppose its device, it's having the latest, greatest device. So it's things like dependencies like that, or in the case of Aadhaar, not to how do you say, shame Aadhaar, because they've been very open about the problems of rolling out their digital identities. So certain areas where the infrastructure is less available, and so people are by default excluded. And so the concern is that digital identity without careful thought and controls can actually accelerate or magnify existing forms of discrimination and inequality. And the risk is, of course, maybe we naively are thinking, oh, wow, it made my financial onboarding much, much easier, so it's done. So, if you think about it from I don't know if even 80-20 is a fair way to solve it, but even if you think about it from the perspective, it made life easier for 80%, but it made life a whole lot worse for 20% who are basically ignored. So decentralized identity is, it is not, I, of course, have talked a lot about the technical aspects of it, but decentralized identity also exists as a set of principles that put individuals more in control of their data. So one of the kind of of course, with Verite, we led in with KYC, KYB, and kind of markers of traditional financial reputation scores. But the same architecture enables a wider range of reputation signals. So instead of, say, a traditional credit score, you could see a world where proof of reliable payment history could be accepted. And there are pilots on these throughout the world. So I'm teeing that one up as saying, that is the end goal for many of us in decentralized identity. It's not simple. It's not a simple, immediate technology problem. It's an ecosystem problem. But that's really what's most exciting for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think as well, there's sometimes a discrepancy when people talk about the networks they have in decentralized identity, and many of these networks really focus on maintaining integrity of data on the network, but they don't link off and marry up real world identity and like the reputation that you just mentioned a moment ago. It's really important that when we're thinking of even like KYB, for example, that it's not just about able to link a claim to a company on chain. It's obviously important then to be able to link that to a real world reputation of a company or an entity. And so it sounds like that's obviously part of what you guys are doing there at Centre also. It's
part of our longer term, part of Centre's founding principles is connecting everyone everywhere, and certainly decentralize the sort of identity element is very key to it, and that's something that we're able to push forward and much more clearly or articulate in the context of the World Economic Forum work.
Oh, nice, excellent. And moving into kind of your work just now at Centre, so what are your goals then as kind of Director of Standards? What are your kind of key things that you're trying to achieve?
So I joined Centre as the Director of Identity and Standards to help address the problems we were seeing in decentralized finance and identity solutions being applied. So what was interesting is seeing the traditional identity approaches being applied and seeing, or things like identity tokens, NFTs, things like that. It was clear that people were trying very clever and, kind of novel ways to solve identity. And, there was a lot of discussion, especially last year, VCs versus soulbound tokens.
I remember it well. Yeah, there's lots of really good podcasts actually that came out of those discussions.
Exactly. And I think what was really interesting about it too was, a lot of the problem with the SSI or decentralized identity kind of approaches was maybe we, myself included, possibly came across as more hand-wringing than we intended to, because, in reality, there's just a lot more infrastructure that's needed to do these things off-chain. And so that's one of the nice challenges that I found, actually, about the DeFi space, was that having a very active developer community means there's a very quick way to understand, like, how do I meet the needs of developers? So it was a really good fit. And what I thought was decentralized identity approaches were a perfect fit to the needs of DeFi. All right. So well aligned architecturally, philosophically, all of these problems of sort of designing open networks, designing interoperability, those were exactly the same language. So yeah, those were exactly my goals, is to sort of have this use case and that tightly inform and then provide and supply these solutions. The main benefit of the DeFi space compared to other areas where I'd worked was that there was the full ecosystem. We had the issuers, the holders, and the relying parties or verifiers. And that's in contrast to a lot of other use cases I had worked on, where we were kind of in the state of issuing everything credentials, where you might use it here, you might use it there, but no one's asking for it, so it's not getting used. So demand and being able to test out that full life cycle in lower stakes cases. And so what I mean by lower stakes is that we were able to tightly control, like, say, the expiration date, and make it so that what you don't want to do is get someone to rely on a new type of identity credentials and then rug pull them by saying, okay, we don't support that anymore, you're on your own. And so we were able to make sure that the use cases we were doing were very sort of responsibly rolled out.
Yeah, interesting. And like you said, like, a big part of your work is standards, Kim. I think these are maybe phrases that people hear, but they're not really sure what they are. Why are standards so important for a new technology like SSI?
Yeah, so standards enable portability and choice to individuals. So it means that you're not locked into silos. You're able to pack up and go. And I think that's especially relevant when you think of what's going on in the social media space right now. I don't know how many new social media, Twitter-like networks I've signed up for. With each one, you're building your new graph, and I'm oversimplifying it, but the standards that fall under the umbrella of decentralized identity apply to a wide range of online interactions. So signing up for a bank account, joining a new social network. And one of the goals is to be able to bring your identity and reputation along with it, and that can help reduce fraud or the risk that someone's posing as you. But also, for someone who is making the bulk of their living selling online, think like an Etsy seller or something like that, that can be really helpful. It's really common for sort of imposters to mimic the design and undercut at a much lower rate. And so these are all kinds of problems that we want to make easier to solve.
So we touched on it a little bit earlier on, Kim. So we talked about, you're also like your technical working group kind of chair of the digital identity at the World Economic Forum. And like I said at the start, you've been working there for, I think, probably 6 months or so. And the organization recently published an excellent report. It's called Reimagining Digital ID. And I just wanted to ask you kind of a few questions about it. And you can check that out online at weforum.org for people that are interested. But what are the most significant barriers to implementing this decentralized identity technology? And as a second part to that question, Kim, how do you think that organizations can overcome them?
Yeah, that was a really exciting part of this, like through the World Economic Forum. So I was a chair of the technical working group, and we had a lot of participants and builders of decentralized identity solutions in more traditional identity space, but then there were a lot of people in Web3 and DeFi contributing as well. And so a lot of the barriers that maybe I experience, it was good to sort of pool that and really be able to articulate it more clearly. So what we found where everyone is struggling is, so the standards and technologies are new, and there are very different approaches to decentralized identity, and to the point that we now have a term for, sort of within the different variations, the best we can get right now is different profiles of interoperability. And you might also call it a layer cake, but then I have a graphic that I use in slides to refer to the SSI layer cake. So you cut into it, and it's like a nice layer cake, but then gummy bears and M&Ms fall out. It's just kind of a mess, right? So where do you even start? This isn't documented anywhere. Maybe you start with you can't really start from looking at the standards and specs necessarily. So maybe you start with, say, a certain vendor, but then you eventually run into problems. So that's a problem. Like, people don't know where to start, and we need to do a lot better to communicate that. I think so that's in terms of someone looking to implement the technology, because I think it's a good idea. So in terms of vendors and implementers, we don't do a good job of describing the value proposition or why it's even useful. So much of what we've done in the past is, look at this, it's blah, but it's decentralized, and that turns out not to be compelling enough to sell. The privacy concerns tend not to be top of mind until it's too late. And effectively, we're competing with the status quo, and we need to sort of do much better. And then lastly, I think where things have historically been naive is implementing in the broader sense. So SSI back, in sort of its original formation, I think was presented as a technocracy of, everyone has all of their data stored, and you share just what you need with someone else. But that runs afoul of existing regulations. And so the messaging around decentralized identity did not meet well with regulators, say, originally talking with Department of Education officials who thought that this is just the worst possible idea because it can't be FERPA compliant. So we collectively have gotten a lot better. We started teasing apart how decentralized identity fits with existing regulations. But so how to overcome that for organizations. And we talk about these in the World Economic Forum report, so I recommend checking that out. But to highlight some key ones, in the technical world, there's really nothing to beat collaborating in the standards and discussion groups. And this really helps you keep your ear to the ground for developments. And also, I think one of the biggest categories of questions that I answer is just, what are the things you don't really need to worry about so much on? There's like maybe a million ways to do it. Maybe some group is, two different groups are working on it. Sometimes your best option is just to get something good enough working and then just wait. But it's hard to know like what to do that. And so that's where it really helps to have groups to discuss those with. And those groups include Decentralized Identity Foundation, or the W3C Credentials Community Group is open to the public. There's a lot of groups focused on interoperability efforts. And then, of course, there's Block's Web 5 effort. They're doing yet another profile of decentralized identity standards, one that Verite actually happens to work well with. So there are communities, again, around all of these. On the policy and regulatory side, a lot of great progress is being made, for example, in the EU wallet reference implementation. That's definitely an area where you just have to keep your ear to the ground. So I think the unfortunate thing for now is just you have to stay pretty plugged in to know sort of what you need to sweat and what you don't, because I think the way that many decentralized identity architectures were described initially seemed very boil the ocean, and that is a huge barrier to entry for organizations.
Especially, as you say, like if the industry as a whole is not good at articulating the business benefits or the benefits to the stakeholders of that organization, we can't possibly imagine that the leaders of those organizations would sanction a fairly significant upheaval, like a boiling of the ocean, like you mentioned, if we're not articulating why they should go to all that effort. So, yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there.
And then on the technical side, if I were a security professional at that company, I would argue it's a horrible idea. You definitely don't want to, there's just so many risks involved with taking on a new technical stack. So there's a lot of reasons to, move more carefully.
Yeah, you need to be everywhere all at once, it sounds like, and it's challenging as well because it's so fast moving from so many different places. It's if you blink, you'll miss something. So, but that's what makes it interesting at the same time.
Yes, definitely.
So Kim, and just the second point, kind of the World Economic Forum publication that you put out. The other thing I was interested to understand was how do we ensure that a digital identity, Kim, is not used for data exploitation or to breach people's data privacy?
So first, I'll start by going into what we mean by data exploitation and privacy concerns. By that, we touched on the ability to correlate, track, label and package you and sell that to other companies and data brokers. And that exists now with our online interactions, but with a digital identity that can happen on a much larger scale. So whether that's through transparency enabled by blockchain transactions, or even just movement to digital ID and the potential for what we talked about, whether phone home or potential tracking for any entity involved in the transmission or storage of your claims. Someone could build a very comprehensive picture of your online interactions, and that could be very appealing to sell. And especially as companies looking to move in this space are describing identity as moving from a cost center to a profit center. We need to be careful about the ways in which they're profiting off of this and ensuring the proper controls exist. And so the solutions are a blend of technical standards and solutions. Those are largely associated with decentralized identity. Now, I also define decentralized identity as not just technical standards and solutions, but it is a set of principles that need to be encoded in regulations. So things like FERPA, things like GDPR or the California CCPA, things like that put more, give more guarantees or assurances to individuals. So, but the last one I think is really around developing user-centered products as well. So, but breaking apart all of those elements. So decentralized identity is really good at focusing on the technical aspects. So what it means to minimize disclosure of, preventing people from tracking you through using unique identifiers through every step of the way. Decentralized architecture, so not storing all the data in one place so that it's so easy to correlate. So at the same time, though, it is more complex. Decentralized identity technologies, when you, naively, the way you might interpret it is to say everyone's running their own infrastructure to store their data, and they're not going to do that. So that's a lot of technical complexity. So they might use some kind of, service or provider to manage that for them. So we need the sort of safeguards, resilience in place, but then a much more than anything, a focus on end user usability. And so, again, because all of these need, these do intersect with regulations, and there is a large amount of problems that the technologies just can't solve. So say even if if I'm running my personal identity hub that stores all my credentials, all my data, once I share it, there's nothing to prevent whoever's using it from making a copy of it and doing whatever. And that's where the regulatory frameworks really come in. And so I think, while it's maybe threatening to a lot of existing companies, I think these approaches that are based on consent and decentralization really do enable different economic models. And they can lower the barrier to entry to compete on different things, like, say, recommendation engines for new types of job opportunities. And so those are the kinds of things. It's sort of frustrating that it takes so long to get to the point where we're still working on the early steps of putting people in control of their data. Once you have that, that's the really exciting part, where you can start opening up a whole new wave of innovation.
It is, and what you're describing there, like the many kind of pieces of the puzzle, if you like, to try and give companies the tools that they need, the standards that they need to build with, but also putting in place the regulation that protects the individuals. The frustrating part for people building in the space is that they're so used to trying to build as fast as they possibly can, and the compliance and the regulation, the standards, they just take time. And it's something that's probably the way it should be, because it allows you to properly assess the technology to make sure it's being implemented correctly, that the regulations are being well understood, and obviously often regulators don't necessarily understand technology well. So I think the frustrating thing as well is that it just takes time and people are trying to build quickly. So there's always seems to be that tension that exists there. So it's never easy.
Exactly. And I think, one thing, say, for example, if you live in the US where there's not a comprehensive data protection framework, one thing that's been nice is the transitive effect of GDPR. So you can't put your head in the sand and say, this doesn't affect me. I think, while sort of little details may be off or, need to be clarified, I think that as an architect, it is really easy to sort of immediately grasp the intent of it, and you can very quickly figure out how to architect. And so, a lot of the murkier areas really come down to sort of documenting and your best intent of it, and keeping good records of all of this, so that say you're wrong, you can address it going forward. So yeah, exactly.
And you talked about being an architect there as well, and prior to your current roles, Kim, you were obviously the architect at the Digital Credentials Consortium at obviously the very prestigious MIT, and there you were designing a kind of certificate system that incorporated blockchain within it. What are the biggest takeaways that you had from your time there that you've been able to use within your new roles? What did you learn? What were the kind of key takeaways that you had?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of aspects. Some that I'll focus on is, in that role, we still struggle to find consumers of the credentials. So, I think that there was the problem that I mentioned earlier of issuing everything credentials in hopes that someone can use it. And so the obvious candidate would be employment systems or other educators. And I think that was it was hard to break into the sort of employment record or HR systems space and everything. So I think, really and fortunately we were able to, over the time that we worked on it, be able to develop much more of a end-to-end use case kind of focus, and that's really key. One of the many reasons you don't want to issue everything credentials. So, zero knowledge proof technologies and things like that are moving forward, but the standards are still really new. And, so the idea, it's kind of risky arming people with massive amounts of identity data since these standards are kind of new. What you really want to do is design, especially now, is design around a use case. And so that was where, that was one area that we were able to really kind of refine. So some examples might be so maybe a university would want to just issue a credential to their students saying, I'm a student of this university, so that they could access a gym or they could get benefits at a local theater. And so it didn't need to have birth date, all this other information. It just needed, I'm a student, right? And so that was really the key part. I think, so we really were able to line that up in Verity, where we could say, the relying parties of the verifiers need only this information, and so we were able to reduce verifiable credential content to say just some way of identifying the subject. They passed this defined business process as of this date, and it's revoked or not. Now, additional identity claims could be layered into that depending on the use case, but we were able to just sort of really refine that. So but then the other thing is that the tech alone is such a small part of it. Governance, especially as you move to regulated use cases, is really key. So there's the concern around reliance on these credentials. So say a KYC credential, things like that. You can't just issue a KYC credential. Say like a centralized, a regulated financial institution cannot in today's world just issue a KYC claim in the US and expect to have some other regulated entity consume that. There's all kinds of compliance requirements against that. So there's the governance that needs to be developed around it. And then all of the sort of business processes and perhaps contractual agreements that are tied to it. So it's kind of a long, messy problem. But that's why you have to really be use case focused. So
yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that sometimes can be part of the good and the bad of this technology. It can be used everywhere, but because it can be used everywhere, sometimes it's difficult to narrow down. So it's a bit of a paradox at times. Kim, I feel like we could, I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I'm conscious that of your time, certainly. So my final question to you is, where do you see this technology in 10 years' time?
Yeah, so I'll break it up briefly into near term, intermediate, and then hopefully within 10 years. So near term, I do think that we're going to see decentralized identity being used in more mainstream identity solutions. So that includes OpenID Connect implementations that are bringing in verifiable credentials and decentralized identity principles. Overall, I think that these standards are helping to nudge many other standards in the direction of privacy and transparency. So that's in contrast to sort of proprietary implementations that have existed. So these are things that mobile driver's license efforts are really kind of helping or confronting, and then these standards are starting to help influence. And we're going to start seeing them used in a range of government identity documents. And we see that in especially US and EU, like in the EU wallet efforts. In the intermediate time frame, we're going to see these approaches being used to ease onboarding, so maybe avoid resharing same identity data, improve portability across institutions. Then in 10 years, hopefully, otherwise I wouldn't be working in this space, is that we can achieve some of the more ambitious goals that we've discussed. So financial inclusion and ability to rely on a wider range of reputation, skills, and competence signals.
Yeah. Well, I guess they say you kind of overestimate what you can do in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. So let's hope that's the case, Kim.
True, yes.
Great. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on to Identity 3, and we'll hope to speak to you again soon.
Okay, thank you so much. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, cheers.